Okay, welcome back. So following on from the free writing technique, there's another technique called clustering, which is a new one to me. I've never heard about it. I haven't heard about it before. So clustering is a bit like a spider diagram, I guess you would call it. It's not helpful that the light is shining off the page, but if you can see this figure here, this diagram, I'll read what the method says. So, to make a cluster, you take a fresh page and choose a word or phrase which represents the subject you wish to write about. For example, you might use single words like water, fire, India, or phrases like love at first sight. Write this nucleus word or phrase in the centre of the page. Circle it and then write down every connection that comes into your head. Let the words or phrases fan out from the nucleus like a branch. Circle each new word and join the circles with little lines or arrows. When you seem to exhaust a particular chain of associations, start another branch. When you come up with a very evocative word, you might start a new chain from that. A cluster gives you a visual map of your thought. It helps you to organise your writing organically rather than sequentially. It can act as a blueprint of a whole poem or prose piece, or you may find most of it dreary but feel intrigued by one strand or one idea that crops up. Clusters are not an end in themselves. Use them to trigger writing. The simplest way is to launch to a focused free write, that is, one where you choose the subject. So the example in the book, they start with the word ice in the middle, and then on one of the branch from ice they have iceberg, submerged, hidden. So it's kind of like having the concrete details, the concreteness of an iceberg, and then thinking about the kind of connotations that can be associated with that. The idea that icebergs are submerged, you only see the tip of the iceberg, and then that could be a metaphor for something hidden. And the opposite side of that branch, they've got cool observer, splinter in the heart, so actual thinking of phrases and almost like character traits that could come from ice. Below it, they've got off a different branch, they've got Ice Age, Sudden Change, and Siberian Britain. So starting to think about setting in place. They've also got off another branch, Iceman, Carton Horse, Slow Melt. And then from the top, they've got Glinting, Frost, Sugar Frosting, Sweet, Brittle Person. And underneath, the person who's written this technique talks a bit about their cluster. So clusters are wholly personal and may seem partly impenetrable to someone else. In the ice cluster shown in figure 1, one strand is connected to my mother's stories about her Canadian childhood, the weekly visits of the Iceman who delivered blocks of ice for refrigeration on a horse-drawn cart. Another strand has splinter in the heart, which I recognise as Graham Greene's observation that writers have a splinter of ice in the heart. The sugar frosting line was the one that grabbed my interest. Sugar frosting reminded me of a certain type of character, effusively friendly yet brittle and cold. And then this is an example of what this writer has then done using their cluster. She has a sing-song voice and gushing manner like she's your best friend, but you know nothing about her and daren't ask. Her whole body looks clenched and her eyes are stony. You wonder what's behind the sugar frosting, and I just think that's such a beautiful piece of creative writing, and it's really intriguing and it makes me want to personally know more about this character, and it also very much sets them up and already begins to indicate a lot of things to the reader about what this person could be like. And it says, remember that this kind of free write is focused in the sense that you select the subject. You should still write them at a rapid pace, allowing the words to pour out. And then there's this second one that I'll try to show you, but once again it's quite hard because of the light shining on the book. But this one, figure 2, is called Grandmother Cluster. and it talks about how it's useful to create clusters for characters in stories or narrative poems. And this is a character cluster I made for a story called The Marvellous Boy. The grandmother appears only through the memories of two characters in the story, but she has a baleful influence. I wanted to get a better sense of her. The cluster gives a portrait of a stern matriarch and the suffocating atmosphere around her. One branch is a list of her favourite admonishments. Sometimes the lines spin into wordplay, judging, grudging, and the alliterative asthma, ask for nothing, the kind of word design often obtained in clusters. For me, the surprising leap in the cluster was from queen bee to cockroach. Then white cockroach cropped up after whited sepulchre, the biblical image for a pious hypocrite. I had no idea what these meant when I was doing the cluster, but I remembered later that the queen of a cockroach nest is white, and the image fitted the story, which is essentially about an invincible unfeelingness, a numbing of the heart. The white cockroach queen represents that in the story and adds to its symbolic level. Without the cluster, I would never have come up with the idea. And I've also done an example of a cluster. I've actually done it for a short story that I'm planning on writing and entering into a competition. I haven't started it yet, but I've gone for quite a long phrase. It's for the Benjamin Literary Prize, as in Benjamin Franklin. So this quote is actually attributed to him. The eye of other people are the eyes that ruin us. If all but myself were blind, I should want neither fine clothes, fine houses, nor fine furniture. I think it might be him, or usually what that prize does is they take a quote from his diary entries or journal entries, and then you have the chance to respond to it through either an essay or a fictional piece. So the above phrase is obviously what I have in the centre, and then I started to just branch off with it based on that phrase. So I thought about, it makes me think about like the whole idea of, I obviously thought of a grand house like a manor, so I thought of the domestic sphere, the whole idea of in the Victorian period where upper middle class households, where you start to have the emergence of the middle class or even upper class households, obviously have the divide of upstairs, downstairs, and the domestic sphere belonged to the kitchen. And I thought the whole idea of there's eyes here too. I thought of a potential character called Flora, who would be like a maid or a scullery maid. Domestic sphere, and from domestic sphere I put kitchen, and then I have the idea of there's fire, it's forbidden, there's pots and pans, steam, alchemy, herbs and spices. Kitchen obviously downstairs, and that links with darkness. And then the whole idea of the other character that I'm thinking of is going to be like a young noble woman, and I want it to be like a love story between Flora and this other young lady, and the idea of like if she was blind, she might be, obviously not, this isn't true, but historically, thinking of historical context, the idea of blindness and how it could be seen as unattractive, and how this character might have an obsession with eyes. So maybe male suitors who come along on social calls to put forward their proposals and basically woo her, I think might always talk about her eyes, and growing up throughout her childhood this has been something that she's always heard about. And sort of the idea of escape to where, and the whole idea of societal judgment. So the whole idea of eyes I want to be really integral to this story, because the eye of other people are the eyes that ruin us. So the whole idea of judgment. But also there's, if all but myself were blind, I should want neither fine clothes, fine houses, nor fine furniture. So that made me think of the rejection of the material. There's a yearning for simplicity, love, gift repulsion, because usually on social calls young men would give gifts to women as a way of trying to make formal introductions and to kind of tentatively, I guess, propose the idea of courtship. And obviously, back then, I can only imagine the pain and suffering that you would have had to endure if you don't have emotional feelings for men, and having to go through that and sort of being forced by society to endure all these social calls that you don't really care about because it's what's expected, it's what's it's what the done thing is, and it would just be horrific. So this whole idea that my character is probably going to have gift repulsion, she doesn't want gift from men because she doesn't care about men and she has no intention of marrying men, and the whole idea of ruin, especially back then in historical times, can mean a scandal. So that obviously made me thought about the whole idea of having a lesbian relationship in this story, and the whole idea that people would turn to lesbian relationships back then, even though they didn't have the lexicon for what a lesbian relationship was. Throughout history, even prior to the Victorian period, it has been well documented or censored, all these different things. And the whole idea that they would turn a blind eye to lesbian relationships because it was like, unfortunately for gay men, it was very much more elite. It was very much in legislation that it was illegal, and in the Victorian period we get the whole sodomite, which is a horrible word, but you have the whole sodomy laws and the idea that if you're discovered, you're going to be put in prison because it's illegal, and sometimes in really extreme cases you could even be hung and all these things. But the idea that they would have turned a blind eye if not for her birth, and that's going to kind of be the crux of the issue in this story, is that because she's born into a noble family and she has these expectations to marry well and continue the family line and produce heirs and blah blah blah, all the traditional sort of stuff, the idea that they can't turn a blind eye to this because and then she would sort of have that resentment of like, oh well, why was I born into this class? If I'd been born like down low, as it were, she'd be able to just, you know, exist and be happy and be with the person she loves. So I've also written on a different branch, like noble lady, she's trapped, expectations, judgment, and the whole idea of family and God, because in the Bible there's a lot to do with God's eyes and that they're ever watchful, they're ever present, and that there's a lot of references to eyes in the Bible. And if I'm going down this historical route, they would probably be quite a religious family, they would be a Christian family. So it's sort of playing with that idea. But I think clusters really do have the potential to help spark interest in ideas and also different connections. So like the whole idea of the kitchen and alchemy, that just suddenly came to me when I was thinking about the idea of pots and pans and steam. And I think for my character, she's going to be someone who, even as a child, she'd sneak down to the kitchens, which is this kind of forbidden world, and to her it's exciting because it's so far removed from her everyday normal life, and she's not really meant to mix with the servants, but for her it's interesting, and she'd probably try and go under the guise of like, oh well, one day I'm going to like live in my own house, and I want, you know, my husband's house to be run well, and all those sorts of ideas. So I'm just going to have a quick look in the book to see if there was anything else. Oh, here we go. So for the activity, it says make 4 clusters followed by focused free writes based on what interests you most in your clusters. Spend no more than 3 minutes on each cluster and the same amount of time on each of your free writes. Choose your nucleus words from these lists, taking at least 1 from each. But once again, you can do it however you want. So the first sort of cluster offering is family, friendship, the end of the affair, fame, rivalry, getting older, conflict. The next group is afraid, angry, sad, hopeful, forgiving, suspicious, jealous, homesick. And then the last collection is house, doll, photo album, flowers, gun, shoes, money. And it says again, underline any parts of your free writes which you feel you could develop further or use as they stand in a poem or story. Which kind of nucleus word worked best for you? An object, feeling, or big abstract idea? Did you find yourself anchoring the abstract idea to specific concrete details? If so, this could be a useful kind of cluster to make when you want to explore big themes which are best translated into the personal and specific. For example, war is a soldier with post-traumatic stress syndrome. Neighbourliness is Marie looking after Sam's dog while he's in hospital. As well as using clusters at the start of any writing, also try clustering anytime you get stuck. So this would actually be a really useful technique, I think, to use in an exam. That exam paper is your own. So long as you don't go outside of the lines, you can use some of those lines to plan or ask your invigilator for some extra paper. And it says when the sentences refuse to march across the page, clusters are much less daunting. So if you're someone who struggles to plan their writing, maybe a little cluster could help get those basic ideas down, and it might just be enough to spark your idea. So I hope this video has helped. As always, any questions, please feel free to let me know. Thank you.